Hi everyone, welcome to our next edition of In Conversations with Fulbright Scholars. My name is James Avanatakis and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission here in Canberra. It's great to have your company. So currently we're experiencing and seeing wildfires going through Southern California and different parts of America and into Canada as well. Now, to talk to us about that and wildfires that impacted Australia during the 2020 summer, we are joined by Hannah Etchells, who is a fire ecologist and also a 2018 Fulbright Scholar. Welcome, Hannah. Maybe we can begin if you could tell us a little bit about your research.
Yeah, so I have just completed my PhD studying fire ecology. And what that is basically environmental science that looks at what happens to plants, animals, fungi, the soil, everything that makes up the bush, basically, after really big wildfire or bushfire events. So similar to what we saw last year in 2019-20 in Australia, what was happening across California in 2018, and what's currently sort of breaking news as of the last few days with the mega fires that are burning across Canada. So yeah, I'm basically trying to work out what's happening to our ecosystems as they recover from these sorts of catastrophic events, and then try and figure out with the huge team of people who are also doing similar things, how we can best manage for that going forward in a future where we're going to be seeing more events like this, unfortunately.
And I mean, that's our perception, isn't it? Like at the moment, and is that we are seeing more and more of these mega fires happen. Is that the case? Is that evidence that they are more regular and we're expecting more of them going into the future?
Yeah, so unfortunately, due to a variety of reasons, but one of the main drivers being climate change. Climate change is sort of the driver across most of the fire-prone areas of the world. But then also there are differences in how, there are other things that also contribute to wildfires becoming more frequent and more severe as well as that. But the overall driver is the climate becoming drier and hotter in these areas that we consider to already be fire prone. So areas where fire has been part of the landscape for millennia, where we have plants and animals that are really well adapted to cope with fire on a certain regime. So fire that burns at a certain severity, at a certain season, with a certain distance between fires in terms of time and also space. But now with our summers in these fire-prone regions like California and Southern Australia, becoming hotter and drier, and specifically our summers becoming longer, hotter and drier with these extended periods without rain, we're seeing an increase in these sorts of catastrophic fire events. And that is projected with the way that climate projections are set to go. They are projected to become more frequent and more severe as well.
So, I mean, there's two questions there, right? There's the first one is prevention, and the second one is adaptability. So, I mean, what can we, if we can respond to both of those? I mean, what can we do to prevent it from happening? Is it about the global response to climate change? Is that the main response that we need? What else can be done?
Yeah, and I think it's such a nefarious thing to say. Yeah, we'll just fix climate change, right? Easy.
Yeah.
And obviously that's actually not a reality for us. We can slow climate change now, but what's going to happen largely in the immediate future is already sort of on the trajectory to happen. And I guess without sounding bleak, prevention is also something that's probably not a word we use so much as we use the word mitigation. So we have to be aware that these events are going to happen. We'd be kidding ourselves to say that we could, find a magic bullet that stopped all wildfires from occurring. And also, because our systems are uniquely adapted to cope with fire and have relied on fire, in fact, for many regenerative processes, we do need a certain amount of fire. So it's about using fire right, finding out as much information as we can about how fire is interacting with things like drought and extended summers, also things like disease outbreak and, in plants and animals, but also in humans. So how it interacts with things like COVID-19, for example, that's a huge one because that sort of has prevented some research from happening, and also the sort of direct impacts of things like smoke on respiratory illness, you know. So
okay.
sort of, so many complications and so many things that need to be considered. So I think the reality of it is we need to learn to live with these sorts of fire events, but there are things that we can do to help mitigate the impact on human life and property, and also to help mitigate the impact on the environment. But yeah, it is an evolving science. And so, and, you know, because it is, because we are studying this in the face of climate change, it's constantly putting up challenges. And so there's constantly questions and new things to overcome. And, you know, people, like all good science, I guess, asking a lot of questions, not always getting it right, sometimes making mistakes, but always attempting to learn from that in adaptive management. So that's what sort of we're trying to do. But yeah, I wish I could say there's a magic bullet that we could say, yep, we can stop this. I think we definitely can mitigate it, and there are definitely things that can be done for that. So that's what I'm working.
So what are some of the mitigating strategies? Yeah.
I guess two things to keep in mind. So I guess I can talk about, we've got two sort of different situations, and I think just for the purposes of this being Fulbright, I'll talk about the differences between somewhere like California and somewhere like Southwest Australia, because those were my two research sites for my Fulbright. And they're really, I guess, in a lot of ways analogous, because they're both Mediterranean climates. Neither of them are anywhere near the Mediterranean, but they have a Mediterranean climate, which means that they have long, hot, dry summers and relatively mild, cool, damp winters. But what we're seeing with climate change is those summers are becoming longer and hotter and drier, with prolonged periods of drought. And anyone who lives in either of those places will tell you it's been last few years, in the last couple of decades, in fact, have been sort of record-breaking drought times. And what that's meant is that we've seen vegetation drying out, we've seen fuel loads accumulating, particularly in places such as California, where unfortunately there hasn't been as much fuels mitigation in terms of something that we call prescribed burning, which some people call hazard reduction burning, lots of different names for it. Basically, prescribed burning is a tool that we use in Southwest Australia to reduce fuel loads in areas that are considered high risk, but also in a way that is environmentally sensitive. So we attempt to burn in smaller patches, low severity fire, to remove those fuel loads, and also to stimulate regeneration and germination of species that might need fire in order to restart their life cycles. So Indigenous people in Southwest Australia, so the Noongar people, have been practicing prescribed fire or traditional burning for millennia. And that's the case as well of Indigenous people across California. However, the main differences is, while in Australia, after European invasion, there was only a relatively short amount of time before European people started implementing their own kind of prescribed fire. Now, I'm not saying it was the same, and it isn't the same as traditional burning in any way. There are similarities in that they both would have removed fuel loads and both would have stimulated regeneration of the bush, but they are fundamentally very different practices. So just to keep that in mind. But what it meant was that the Southwest Australian bush more or less never really had a period of fire suppression. There were always these small fires being lit, with the exception of a few, about 20 years or so. There were all these small fires being lit. So fuels were managed quite well in that way across the Southwest Australian bush. In California, it's a completely different story. So the main difference in California is that you're probably familiar with a character called Smokey the Bear.
Yeah, I do have a Smokey the Bear t-shirt. Yeah, only you can prevent fire. Only you can prevent fires. Is that right?
Yeah. And while Smokey the Bear had a lot of great conservation messages and probably got a lot of young kids really excited about nature, unfortunately, the word prevent in there is something that probably, I don't know, for a fire ecologist anyway, that rings alarm bells, because preventing all fire in a fire adapted ecosystem is also not a good idea. And that's basically what California has done. So for the last 100 years in California, they've practiced what's called fire suppression. So that doesn't just mean that, so they weren't doing any prescribed fire at all, but also on top of that, whenever any fires did break out, they immediately suppressed them where they could. Obviously, sometimes they got out of hand, but really they didn't let fires burn. They didn't ignite any purposeful fires for any sort of fuels management. And that's quite different to how California would have been being managed when Indigenous people were the custodians of the land still. And so what that's meant is that we've seen, particularly throughout the Sierra Nevada hills and mountains where I work, we've seen this incredible fuel load accumulation over the last 100 years. So there's basically 100 years worth of fuel, and by fuel I mean twigs and branches and leaves and pine needles, stacked up and up and up on the forest floor. And another reason why it's so bad, particularly in the Sierra Nevada, is because that climate is Mediterranean, but most of the precipitation isn't rainfall, it's snow. And what that means is that there's not a lot of decomposition. So not a lot of things can rot away, because for some of the year, they're frozen solid under snow. And then they get some sort of, cool, damp times in the spring. Then they have a long, hot, dry summer with no precipitation, no rain at all, where things also can't rot away because it's not damp enough, it's very dry. And then they get frozen over again. So there's not a lot, the two things are that there's not a lot of natural decomposition, so the wood can't rot away. So what it needs is fire in order to reduce those fuel loads. It hasn't had fire for around 100 years now. And that's one of the main reasons why, when those fires ignited in the hills and in the mountains in 2018, when I was studying at Berkeley, it's a very surreal time to be studying wildfire in the US, those fires became so out of control so quickly. It was fueled by the weather, obviously high winds, hot temperatures, a decade of drought before that. But then what happened was there was so much fuel for that fire to burn through that these fires basically became unstoppable. And they created what's known as a pyrocumulonimbus, or multiple of those, which is basically a firestorm. So a fire that burns so hot and so severely that it creates its own weather event with its own lightning. And then that lightning strikes ahead of the fire. And you can see how they got themselves into, California was in a very bad situation late in 2018.
Yeah. Wow, that's a pretty scary picture that you draw. Is there a plan to change practices in California?
Yeah.
Is this your research? Is this what we're heading towards now?
Yay! Yeah. Exactly. Thank you. And so what's great, the silver lining of any catastrophic event, we've seen a few of them in the last couple of years. The silver lining is that it draws attention to those things. And what that means, generally attention equals dollars spent on research. We've seen that with the fantastic sort of really rapid response to COVID-19 and all these vaccines being made available, or hopefully available, but, being created. And we've seen that as well with the response to what happened in 2018 in California and what happened in 2019-20 in Australia. So now there is a real interest in trying to solve these problems. And so now one of the things that they're trialing in California, and one of the parts of my research, they've sort of got themselves in a bit of a sticky situation, because now the fuel loads, particularly in the Sierra Nevada around Lake Tahoe, where I was working, are so high that even trying to put in a controlled burn, a prescribed burn to reduce that fuel would be very dangerous for the risk of it becoming out of control, because there is so much fuel. So now what we're thinking of is sort of experimenting with other ways of removing that fuel. So my research was looking at how we could do this technique called mechanical thinning. I'm going to reference ex-President Trump for a minute. And in November 2018, when I was evacuated from Berkeley, 250 kilometers away from the fire front, because the smoke was so bad that it blanketed the entire San Francisco Bay Area for nearly a month, Trump went and visited one of the towns that the fire had already burnt through. One of the fires had already burnt through. And he stood there and he said that they should be raking the forest. I don't know whether you remember this. And it was a bit of a, everyone was just like, what? And obviously, like, all of me and my fire, like, losing it, laughing at this. But then I realized that kind of what I was studying, in a way, was mechanical thinning, which is using really big, if you think of logging equipment as really big rakes,
Right.
we're basically going into the forests and strategically removing some fuels from the forest floor in order to reduce fuel load. So when a fire does ignite, it can't burn for as long, can't burn as hot.
Oh, okay.
So I guess whilst he was literally talking about people using rakes, which is, quite laughable, the principle behind that is, I guess a little true. We can manage these fuel loads by removing things from the forest. Now, again, this is a really, this technique is quite unpopular for some people, a lot of people who live in that area and who've always seen the forest be so scrambly and wild and stacked up with wood and branches and leaves and, so dense you can't walk through it, right? That's what they are used to. That's what they've always lived next to, even though it's literally threatening their lives. So us taking in, small scale logging equipment and removing branches and stuff like that is seen as quite, I guess, can be seen as quite damaging to the ecosystem from somebody who, has always seen it in a certain way. And so what my research was doing was going in and getting that data to show that actually, like after a fire is a disturbance, right? It changes how the ecosystem looks for a little while, but then the forest regenerates. And basically what we found with the mechanical thinning was, yes, it looked a little bit drastic when the stuff was first removed, right? It looked like some people had been through there with logging equipment and taken out, branches and twigs and also some small trees and things that would naturally be consumed in a small scale fire, right? However, what we found was in the subsequent 10 years, so I was actually going there 10 years after they trialed this technique, there were very few differences in the biodiversity, so which species were there and how many of them were there in the areas that had been mechanically thinned compared to the ones that they'd used some small-scale prescribed fire in. And also the main thing that was really nice to see is that the health of the remaining trees increased sort of hugely, so 3 times as healthy, so trees growing 3 times as quickly, being 3 times as resilient to future disease and future fire. And so even though it seems destructive, what we were doing was actually helping those ecosystems to become more resilient to future fire and also removing that risk of mega fire by taking out some of those fuels. Now, we did this on a really small scale compared to what's needed across the entire Sierra Nevada and across a lot of California as well. But it's, I guess, just a small scale approach to show that there are multiple approaches we can take to try and mitigate these sorts of situations. It's very different to the work that I'm now doing over here in Australia, because here we haven't really experienced that extreme fire suppression that they did in California. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So ultimately, then that process of raking, if I can use President Trump's term, that process of scientific raking, may I say? So ultimately,
you can rake America.
You can rake America great again, yeah. But so in a way, then that mimics controlled or managed fire. Is that the idea? And
Not exactly, but it does enough in terms of removing fuel loads. So it doesn't do things like, it doesn't have those chemical cues that come from smoke that stimulate germination. Yeah. It doesn't deposit nutrients into the soil in the same way that an ash bed does after a fire. And it obviously doesn't create heat, which is something that's sometimes needed for breaking some seed dormancy and for some plants to release their seeds even. So it's definitely not a preferable thing to use, but in extreme cases where it's too dangerous to even consider a prescribed burn, it's basically a tool in our belt that we can apply.
Amazing. Yeah, fantastic. And just one final question before I let you go. So I mean, I think one of the attitudes of us humans has always been that if I want to build something somewhere, I should be able to build it. I mean, I think the last few years have shown that we also need to think about where we do build things. Is that been part of the sort of the discussion around mitigation and where people choose to live?
Yeah, I am quite passionate about this, and I, as someone who is obviously like a nature lover and would give anything to just be surrounded by as many trees as possible at all times, I completely sympathise with people that want to live out in the dense wilderness, you know, with one road in and one road out, and no one can ever disturb them. Absolutely, give me that. But in the world we currently live in, and what we're sort of heading to in the future, it just might not be the most responsible thing to do. And I think that there are ways around this. And one of the things that I work on over here in New South Wales now is to help landholders who are a lot of the time in these areas. So my program is called Hotspots. I work with the Rural Fire Service and the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales now. And the program we run called Hotspots is looking at exactly that. It's contacting and getting in contact with landholders who live out in these areas that are most at risk from wildfire, and teaching them and giving them the tools and the confidence and the knowledge to apply prescribed fire on their properties in a way that's both ecologically sensitive, reduces fuel loads, and that also is sensitive to the traditional owners of that land as well, because I'm sure you're aware, all across Australia, Indigenous people and fire history is really interlinked. And so we run these workshops where we educate landholders, we get them all together in their local community hall, we get them to create a fire management plan for their property, where they outline all of their assets and you know, things like that, their dams, their water sources, but also all of the different vegetation types that need different sorts of fire applied to them. So some types of vegetation need fire every 5 to 10 years, others every 10 to 20 years, and other vegetation types like rainforest, for example, doesn't need fire at all, and in fact, can be damaged by it. So we teach them all of these sort of things about it, and then the second day of the workshop is we actually go out with them on their property, and we show them how to put fire on the ground. So we go out there with the drip torches, and we actually do a small scale prescribed burn on their property, with everyone standing around and having a look and, you know, having a go. And all of the safety protocol is there because we've got the Rural Fire Service on standby in case anything goes wrong. But effectively what we're doing is we're empowering landholders to realise that fire doesn't have to be scary. Even though they live in an area that's, you know, quite high fire risk, we want them to feel confident that they can do the most they can to mitigate the impacts of any future fires that come through. So realistically, fires are going to come through their area again in the future. But if they're as prepared as they can be with their fire management plan, they've reduced their fuel loads, they've been using fire strategically on their property in a way that's ecologically sensitive, then yeah, they're going to get the best fighting chance they can.